Order, order. I'm going to make a start. Sorry to interrupt. All these conversations, which are part of the point of the evening, and I hope will continue as we go on. My name's Alan Finlayson. I am the Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Barry, Amiel and Norman Melburn Trust that has helped put on this lecture this evening, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Trust before I hand over to Esther Leslie from the Birkbeck Institute of Humanities to introduce proceedings overall. So the Barry, Amiel and Norman Melburn Trust is a small charity, a grant-giving charity, founded by originally Barry Amiel in honour of his friend Norman Melburn and then in honour of Barry himself. The two of them grew up in 1930s East End London as young Jews facing and fighting down the fascist threat of their time. They became members of the Communist Party together, and in Norman's honour, Barry hoped to set up a trust that would build a college that could spread the information, ideas and understanding of the world and of history and of politics that they had learned in the Communist Party. The trust wasn't able to create a college, but it has ever since been a research-focused charity. Its original aims were to promote knowledge and understanding of the history and theory of the workers' movement, of the philosophy of Marxism, and it still continues to support that, but it has made its aims more broadly applicable to support all kinds of interpretations of history, which we are not wedded to one of them, as well as all kinds of emancipatory movements, whether they be about gender or sexuality or the environment or class or decolonial, whatever it might be. We fund all kinds of things on an open application basis. If you want to find out what we fund, you can look on our website here and you can see that we funded everything from community physical defence classes for marginalised communities to research into the history of police surveillance of political organisations, to exhibitions for peace, to research and action helping support land workers resisting the far right in rural parts of this country, and many, many more. We also fund some organisations for a few years at a time, like the World Transformed, for example, and we offer long-term support for all kinds of organisations providing training, research and so forth about the issues with which we're concerned. We also, and we're very proud of and would like you to go and check out our online archive of radical writings, where you can find significant print runs of magazines like Marxism Today, the former theoretical and discussion journal of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but also older publications, Universities and Left Review, founded by Stuart Hall, E.P. Thompson's New Reasoner, and feminist publications like Red Rag, a key journal of Marxist feminism in the early 70s. So please do go on that archive and have a look. And if you happen to stumble across in your attic some full run of some interesting lost publication, tell us about it, and we can digitize it and make it available online. We also fund an annual lecture, which has never really been annual and is today not even really a lecture. But it's been going on for 25 years or so with luminaries, Eric Hobsbawm, Noam Chomsky, for example, Terry Eagleton. More recently, in our partnership with Birkbeck, Jodie Dean, Achille Mbembe, and Michael Hart. This year, for various reasons, we decided not to have a single lecture, but to have a panel. And one of the reasons was, of course, you don't need me to editorialise too much, because we felt that the issue of the radical right and how to resist it was so important and was something that we needed to hear many different voices speaking on, and hopefully voices that will help you think, and your voices will help us think. And we invite you at the end of the evening to go back into the foyer for a drinks reception and some nibbles, to keep talking to yourselves, to each other, and to the panel as well. And you can also talk to us, members of the Board of Trustees. We have these little badges on. If you see one of us wandering around, come and ask us about what the Trust does, how you can apply if you want to do so, or even how you can give us money. So I'd like to welcome you then to this event, which I'm looking forward to and I'm sure is going to be of great value to all of us, and I'm going to hand over to Esther Leslie to introduce the main event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan. Welcome everybody to this event. As said, I'm Esther Leslie, co-director with Jacqueline Rose of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities, and we're thrilled to partner with the Amiel Melburn Trust to offer this annualish, lecture-ish thing, I think, for the 5th time. And it takes place within the parameters of the London Critical Theory Summer School. So some of the students from that school are here, at which this year we've been delighted to again have hosted 2 former Amiel Melburn lecture speakers, Jodie Dean and Achille Mbembe. Now, I don't want this introduction to be longer than the panellists have to speak, and you have those online descriptions. I'm going to give some micro introductions, explain the format, and then hand over to them. So, first up, I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Kojo Koram in the Law Department at Birkbeck, also uses his legal skills to advise at release. He's written amazing books, Britain and the Aftermath, and drugs and all sorts. I noticed he's talking with Gary Economics Stevenson at the Union Chapel on Friday, which is sold out. So we are so lucky to have this more intimate encounter with him. Really? Co-editor of New Internationalist, I think also linked to the Morning Star. In the past, and writes on migration, reproductive and sexual politics, genocide in Gaza, and more. So welcome. Third will be Rob Topinka, who's the same school as me, the School of Creative Arts, Culture and Communication. Rob's work of late has been around monitoring racism and the far right in culture, online communities, thinking about the spread of conspiracy theories, memes, and welcome to Liz Fikater, Director of the Institute of Race Relations and a campaigner in Defatic against fascism and the far right. I don't know if you radical leader, which is just really fascinating. Did Sina faculty previously at Birkbeck, are amazing, and also founder of the Birkbeck Humanities, which runs this much else. He's well known in the UK and Greece and beyond as a critic of and a writer on human rights. He's a former member of the Greek Parliament as part of the Radical Left Coalition. So each of these speakers will talk for just 5 minutes. That will bring us to a point of some conversation between them, which should take us up to about 6:30, at which point we'll open up to the floor, gathering questions, invite responses from the panellists, and we will end this part, we hope, at 7 with the reception outside. So, yes? Liz? I said Liz.
You can do me all over again if you like. I mean, make everyone jealous. Do me twice, yeah.
So, Kojo, off you go.
Brilliant. First of all, thank you, Esther, Jacqueline, everyone at the Birkbeck Institute of Humanities, and obviously everyone also at the Barry Amiel and Norman Melburn Trust for inviting myself to be in conversation with these fantastic speakers. Talking about confronting the rise of the radical right in 2025 is an auspicious task, especially within 5 minutes, especially thinking about how do we frame this idea of the radical right. Do we talk about the kind of eruption of street-based anti-migrant violence that really reached an apotheosis here in the United Kingdom with the riots that followed the violence and murder in a town where I actually grew up in Merseyside, Southport? Do we want to talk about the emergence of draconian authoritarian state regimes all across Europe and North America, or do we want to kind of really focus on the horrors that we're seeing in the United States with bordering policing, repression of protest, and kind of widespread withdrawal from the presuppositions of liberal democracy that we're seeing really being advanced by the Trump administration. I think for me, that kind of state repression is where I'd want to kind of start in my small kind of contribution. I think that this year has been the year where the conversation, as we've seen, not just within the academy but outside as well, has finally come to the realization that what was seen as a crisis or a set of temporary crises since the 2008 financial crisis is actually much more of a permanent state of condition. And that kind of recognition of a particular epoch coming to a close, whether we might define it as neoliberalism, and we can draw on definitions of neoliberalism from David Harvey to Quinn Slobodian, whatever we might want to frame it as, with the withdrawal of the Trump administration from the architecture of globalization, we're starting to see that economic consensus falling apart. We're seeing Liberation Day, where there's the expansion of all these tariffs to restrict the presumptions of free trade. We're seeing, the big beautiful bill, as Trump describes it, and its attempt to try and shift that economic consensus. But this is not a kind of withdrawal from neoliberalism that would have been anticipated in the anti-WTO kind of struggles of the Seattle moment of the late 90s. Instead, what we're seeing is the kind of rejection almost of the politics of perpetual growth and the assumption that now the role of the state is to allow for this authoritarian draconian violence to preserve these relations of inequality on a much more permanent basis, leading to some of the frictions and disputes even within the MAGA movement that we are seeing when we might think about, the division that emerged over the HB1 visa, where, people assume that, we want to have this kind of Dubai-style guest worker visa relationship that allows people temporary entrance into the country as long as it's economically profitable, actually coming up against this requirement for increased policing, increased bordering violence, and increased relegation of surplus populations from the production of capital. And so we're seeing that explicitly in the United States. We're also seeing that very much here in the United Kingdom. Not a week goes by where we have leading members of, whether it's the Reform Party, whether it's Robert Jenrick and the Conservative Party, facilitating this rhetoric of the only way that you can hold society together, that you can remain coherent, is by not improving living standards, not by facilitating economic growth, despite how often Labour Party talk about it, but by enacting a kind of spectacular violence on marginal populations, whether that's trans populations, whether that's migrant populations, asylum seekers, that are going to give the masses of the United Kingdom whose living standards are decreasing the psychic pleasure that will replace the material pleasure of actually having improved living conditions. And so my 5 minutes has actually gone relatively quickly, because I wanted to get to, whilst marking out, I think that this is the place that we're at the moment, this place where state violence is using the rhetoric of the radical right in order to justify this kind of draconian policing in order to preserve these relations of inequality. I think talking about it here in London, it is also worth thinking about how can we oppose that and how can we resist that. And I think there's been a kind of moment of rupture, a moment of potential optimism that's been provided by London's kind of sister city in New York City with the recent mayoral democratic election of Zohran Mamdani, which I think, and here as a part of a critical theory school, I think it's worth, and nobody likes to be read through their parents, so I'm sure he will hate me for this if he ever hears this, but thinking about how some of the material critique that Zoran's father, Mahmoud Mamdani, which pulled against the kind of representative liberal politics of sovereign national liberation in the post-colonial state, has been kind of filtered into this new moment of late-stage capitalism through his son in order to try and push things towards, or push things beyond kind of more liberal representative identity politics and trying to bring together a consensus and a coalition based around material interests. And I think that that's going to be one of the few responses that we can have to the rise of the far radical right, because what Trump is doing in America, what Reform promised to do here in the United Kingdom, is not going to improve people's material conditions. Despite the performative violence upon marginalized populations, the kind of squeeze on living standards will continue to perpetuate exponentially. And so does that provide an opportunity to try and address those material conditions as a way of creating new coalitions? I think the example of what we've seen in the US presents potentially some guiding light. So with that, I will close, but thank you.
Thank you for inviting me on the panel. I agree with the kind of making it a panel rather than an individual lecture, because at a time of rising reactionary politics, I think it's more important than ever to come together at events like these and share stories of struggle and to kind of combat isolation as well. I am a co-editor at New Internationalists. We are a global justice magazine and a media cooperative. We are run by our workers and owned by our readers, and I think this is an important model, especially in this day and age when we're seeing kind of escalating far-right attacks on the press. So I think this is a more resilient model. No one can pull funding from us. I think independent journalism plays a really crucial role in the investigation and exposing of far-right networks. But unfortunately, far too often the mainstream media has played the opposite role by normalising the far-right, platforming reactionary voices. So when we think of, the disproportionate airtime given to Nigel Farage and his MPs, when his party is a similar size to the Greens and they do not get much airtime at all, or the so-called refugee crisis narrative in 2015, a framing that gave a lot of oxygen to an already mobilised far-right by painting refugees as a threat and a drain on supposedly limited resources. So back in 2011, New Internationalists, I say we, I wasn't at the publication at the time, but anyway, collectively, published a cover story titled "The Far Right Gets Respectable," warning of this mainstreaming. And we're revisiting the topic in our upcoming edition, which is going to be on the global far right and what we can do to resist it, which is why I'm on the panel today. Because something that did seem like a creeping threat has now gone increasingly global, and it has done so really, really fast. The far right is not a monolith, but there are definitely unifying drivers, which is something I've been looking into as part of my research for this magazine and my reporting. We see opposition to immigration and minority rights, climate denial, and attacks on democratic institutions. And these parties and movements are increasingly building transnational alliances. At the first CPAC conference in Argentina in December, President Javier Milei spoke about creating an international right, kind of using the language of internationalism that's often associated with progressive movements. And we see that they're kind of sharing tactics and playbooks and personnel. Something else we're looking at in this edition is how one of Orban's political consultants is kind of operating under the radar in Eastern Europe and in Latin America, helping other far-right parties to gain power. So that's why we really wanted to look at this moment as a global phenomenon rather than just within national contexts, expose international links and identify who are the enablers of reaction around the world, because the more we know, the better equipped we are to push back. And of course there's a lot at stake, as Kojo has outlined. Also we see kind of the spread of anti-gender movements as well. This is the attack and rollback of various rights under the guise of protecting the natural family. So when we see attacks against same-sex marriage, abortion rights, sex education, trans people, this is not kind of all by chance, it's all a kind of coordinated and very organised thing that's going on. This is something I've done reporting on last year in Ethiopia. I saw kind of US Christian right groups trying to influence Politicians there to roll back the country's quite liberal abortion law, countries in the same region, and trying to influence the African Union. And this far right. So I am based in Barcelona. I live in Catalonia, and I've also seen some quite strange alliances there as well. So in the town of Recol, which is a far party governs the local municipality, and despite the fact that they are very pro-independent, like Catalan independence, they've aligned with Spain's far-right Vox party, who are very anti-independent, one of the main ideologies of that party, but they align on being Islamophobic and hating Muslims. And so these contradictions show how ideology bends when they can unite on the politics of hate. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I should have done a timer as well.
I'm not sure.
But yeah, what we really wanted to put across with this edition that's coming out as well is that there is resistance, there's small fires everywhere. I recently visited a town also in Catalonia called Malgrat de Mar. Locals have kind of revived the memory of a little international solidarity when townspeople there and fishermen saved international brigaders who had been travelling to Spain on a ship that was bombed by a Mussolini submarine. 50 people died on the boat, but many others were rescued. And this history was almost completely erased. But now artists and educators are kind of working with young peoples in school to reclaim that story. And I would say remembering is also a form of resistance, especially in a country like Spain, where the fascist past was never fully confronted and where Vox is now kind of annulling laws on historical memory. So there's a continuation there. I wouldn't say that some things that are happening now are fascist, but I think looking to the past to see struggles before, there's a lot to be learnt. So yeah, I'm working with journalists at the moment across the world, in India and Argentina, looking at how trade unions, communities and activists are resisting the politics of hate and defending communities at the sharp end of their policies. So yeah, I think it's our role as journalists and as storytellers to get those stories out there, to learn from them and to look for alternatives to reactionary politics.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about the online world a little bit and give some examples of what I've been calling ambient extremism and suggest some ways it might be changing politics. So the examples are kind of disparate, but there's a thread from just before last summer's riots here in the UK to the recent release of the Casey report, the report on child sex grooming. So Jordan Peterson had Tommy Robinson on his podcast in June 2024, and Robinson spent 90 minutes raging against the establishment for ignoring grooming games, as he claimed. Next, Peterson interviewed Nigel Farage and then Elon Musk, who soon began harassing two-tier Keir, as he called him, on X. And at first, Starmer rightly said this was right-wing propaganda, and then he caved to it. Musk's role in this affair was widely covered, Robinson's less so, particularly in recent reporting. But last summer, just before Musk started posting at Starmer on X, references to grooming gangs were kind of ambient in the transnational Anglophone reactionary discourse. So you might not recognize all these names, you're lucky if you don't. But before he posted at Starmer, Musk was responding to posts from Robinson, who's well known, Andy Ngo, Tristan Tate, an account called Indian Bronson, who posts about shared Indo-European myths. And this is what I'm describing as ambient extremism. And it used to be kind of in the days of the alt-right, that extremist memes, tropes, arguments, and ideas would circulate on the chans, in alt tech spaces, and only occasionally surface in mainstream discourse, as when Svella Braverman used the phrase cultural Marxism. But now that distinction has collapsed. Extremism has become ambient. It's become part of the political atmosphere. It's ubiquitous, but it's effervescent. It's unpredictable in its effects. So another example of this is the X account formerly called Europe Invasion with two N's. It's changed its name. But in July 2024, this account was one of the first to post the infamous piece of misinformation that the Southport attacker was a failed Muslim asylum seeker. And then in the month during the riots, in the summer, the account racked up 350 million views and 5 million likes on X, which is not bad for 1 month. Almost all of the posts were relentlessly anti-Islam. And the account's most successful post, which I'm sorry I'm going to subject to you now, was viewed 11 million times. It's this obviously AI-generated image of a kind of racialized scene of theft of enjoyment. And after the success of this post, the account began posting variations on this kind of fall of Christendom tableau set in Ireland, Sweden, England, and Spain. So it found a bit of success and kept running with it. You can take it off now if you don't mind, because it's so the account holders were later revealed to be a Muslim couple living in Dubai, yet they were posting all this anti-Islam content. But personal motivations are perhaps less important than the way they were able to ride a wave of digital attention. These sorts of waves are always fleeting, but they shift the sediment as they go. And it's worth, with a bit of theory, I guess, to remind ourselves that digital platforms are cybernetic systems. And the word cybernetics comes from the Greek word kybernetes, or helmsman, as it's often noted in the kind of critical cybernetics literature. The cybernetic helmsman creates a channel by navigating it, in an analogous way to Pascal's believer, who doesn't kneel because he believes, but believes because he kneels. The helmsman doesn't have a kind of abstract guide or abstract concept that is later put into action. The cutting of the path is also the planning of the path. And this is kind of how digital culture works. Posting resonant content creates new channels for resonance, and as these post by post accumulate into these channels, this is what's precipitating ambient extremism. So last summer, as I mentioned, Peterson interviewed Robinson, Musk, and Farage, but he also interviewed a science writer extolling the health benefits of red meat, an astronomer on Mars colonization, and an evolutionary psychologist describing the woke left as the devouring mother. So this might seem like an incoherent list, but this incoherence is actually a kind of strategy, and it's indexed to an ideological orientation that we can specify as reactionary digital politics. And it starts from the premise that the liberal establishment has gone too far in almost all arenas of social life. Immigration law, diversity statements, yes, but also sex, space exploration, diet and exercise, health and wellness. Everywhere liberals have gone too far, and their actions, quite conveniently, are recorded on social media, so they need to be shared. Think libs of TikTok. And then they need to be opposed. Think someone like Paul Joseph Watson here in the UK, Matt Walsh maybe in the US. So what liberal commentators tend to frame as extremism, online extremism, has become ambient, and this makes it harder to identify what the radical right is or the populist right, or to define their politics as fascist. It's attuned to outrage, but it's also improvisatory. It finds its form through this kind of relentless A/B testing characteristic of social media. And what happens is this creates a kind of parallel arena to party politics, one that Keir Starmer has bowed to, perhaps without fully realizing what happened. And it's notable, I think, that Tommy Robinson initially achieved fame by founding a party, the English Defence League, but he's got rid of the party form and taken up the influencer function. And that's quite a prescient move by him, actually. And despite their differences, Robinson and Europe Invasion are both attuned to ambient outrage, both capable of stoking it, and they're both unconstrained by logical coherence. So this creates problems for critiquing it. And part of the issue is sort of liberal commentators and also the left have been focused more on critiquing it than on fighting the information battle they're fighting. So the success or failure of Robinson, his relationship to Reform UK, the success or failure of Reform UK, which itself is kind of an ersatz party that first took shape on social media, that has been successful on TikTok, sort of stoking outrage. Their success is reliant on their ability to ride these attention waves. And I think one thing the left needs to do is figure out how to fight them rather than to critique them. I'll end there.
I've got some slides, but I don't know how to use the clicker. Help! Why am I getting anywhere? Oh, boom! It's not easy to do a 5-minute presentation, especially if you're someone like me who gets into a muddle very easily. So I wanted to start with a provocation. Is the real problem the radical right, or is the real problem the extreme centre? and aren't both equally culpable for manufacturing hate, while actually the extreme centre is actually the more powerful of the two, because it can put the state's imprimatur on racism through its laws and policies. I ask myself, are we living in an age of smoke and mirrors, where the illusion is created that as long as we combat the radical right, all will be well? I think we have to ask, what is the source of the authority of the radical right? And I think we have to look at material conditions and global structures, the things that nurture the radical right and make it smoke and mirror fear-mongering such a powerful tool in keeping us all divided and in our place. This is a new age of imperialism, militarism and resource wars, whether for oil, minerals, water. And our governments are fighting for pole position in an unstable world. It's very unseemly when you see our Prime Minister sucking up to Donald Trump. Okay. It's an advert for our work, basically. Our hollowed out parliamentary democracies are now morphing into authoritarian rule. And I think it's extremely telling in terms of the world order that the British state is backing, that the first civil disobedience campaign in modern history ever to be prescribed in this country, or likely to be prescribed in this country, is Palestine Action. This new age of competing imperialisms demands the militarisation and securitisation of European societies. British rearmament is to be paid for by another bout of austerity. Talk about spectacular violence on marginalised communities. Sorry, Koji, I'm stealing you. The shameful attack on disabled people has made the violence of all of this more real. Alongside militarism goes attacks on the disabled. They are the ones who are expected to pay. And what does this tell us about the zeitgeist of our time? Today it's all about the survival. Conservative political action at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Budapest, and CPAC is basically the route for EU parties into the United States. At this conference, they declared it to be the America first, England first, Netherlands first. You know what? It's not rocket science. You can't all be first at once. It's this kind of thinking that led Europe into 2 world wars. We can't all be first. It's the road to hell. So if we are talking about resistance to the radical right, this is where we need to start. We need a rules-based international order and a respect for human rights that protects us from the global bullies. That means standing up for civil rights of each and every vulnerable group. We cannot afford to work in silos. CPAC links the fight against migrants to the defence of the traditional family. Bordering processes are not just about physical borders. Borders are against foreigners in housing, and borders are against trans people, most absurdly, in toilets. Once again, it's all smoke to suggest that it's only the radical right that are intent on ripping up international law. Labour wants changes to the European Convention on Human Rights. This attack on human rights is all very Trumpian. But of course, Labour does it its own way, the English way, the cricket way, with talk of fair play and prioritising the rule of law over the rule follower, over the rule breaker. And neither is it just the radical right that is mainstreaming hate. We talked about the KC review and the Labour's role in that. In our recent report, well, it's not that recent actually, it's about a year old. Actually, I think it's 2 years old. In this report, we looked at the way that mainstream politicians have mainstreamed Islamophobia and anti-foreign racism, and how they created the condition for last summer's far-right orchestrated racist riots. And now we've seen an attempted pogrom unfolding in Northern Ireland. Starmer might have his own reasons to regret his Islands of Strangers speech. Who knows what goes on in his mind? But does it really matter what he says? For it's hypocritical to regret those words when every other way Labour is pursuing the base populism that creates the material conditions for another bout of far-right violence. Most decidedly through their policy decisions to ethnicize and racialize crime, publishing data on foreign national crime, the creation of league tables on which nationalities commit more offences, all a prelude, I believe, to ICE-style raids and collective flights and deportations. Since media reportage of the Casey review into gang-based grooming, we've seen a new iteration of the Football Lads Alliance, now Football Lads Against Grooming Gangs, who marched in London last weekend. And last weekend, we also saw a petrol bomb thrown at a Blackburn mosque. And it's here where the role of the charlatans and fearmongers of the radical right comes into play. I do not need to name them because I probably have a libel action. Anyway, you know who they are. These are the grand illusionists with their smoke and mirrors and cheap conjuring trips. Every week conjuring up fantastic images of Muslim rape gangs, illegal immigrants invading our coastline, illegals having too many children and sucking up child benefits. We're talking about people who sit in Parliament, in TV studios, and are enablers of the far right. To conclude, what can we do? Well, please sign up to RO News. Support my work of my colleagues who are giving you the information that you need every day. We can't look to political mainstream for answers. It all depends on us now. Not since the 1980s have the street, the community, civil society been so important in building up frontline defence. That is why the global communities of conscience, the communities and battalions and flotillas throughout the world, the communities of resistance that are formed around Palestine are so important. They are leading the way in showing what sort of resistances we need to build. The response to the radical right is internationalism and intersectional solidarity. And anti-racism embedded in anti-imperialism is the only riposte to the survival of the fittest philosophy of the new global world order.
Thank you for the invitation. Two statements. The rise of the extreme right is the result of the mutation of capitalism into neoliberalism and its bastard progeny, and the failure of the left. And I'm coming from a left party that became government, the only one in Europe back in 2015. Okay, these were the two axioms, and let me give now 5 theses about the reasons that the right-wing, the extreme right, is coming up, and ways in which we can resist it, although I will leave the resistance, the main aspects of resistance, for later. First, economic crisis, capitalist crisis. We have a huge increase of inequalities, of poverty. We have, job insecurity, precarious work. We have the decline of the welfare state. We have the weakening of all sense of certainty that people had up until now. Second, the decline of liberal democracy. Now, democracy and capitalism were never great friends. They were opposites. They were enemies in the 19th century. And today, or the last 50 years, they have a kind of marriage of convenience, but this is now unraveling with the, with the coming up of the illiberal democracy. And we see that with the weakening of political institutions, of political parties, of all mediating institutions like the church, like law, like trade unions, and therefore the development of this direct link between the influencer or the political leader and the people without mediation. The third is a nostalgia for a certain ethno-sovereignty, ethno-nationalism. And it is true that over the last 30 years, globalization and cosmopolitanism has weakened the nation state, nationalism, sovereignty. And what is being argued now by the extreme right is that they're going to return to a powerful state and a proud nation. And this is something that we have to understand and we have to react against. We cannot just, say we the left, we know that this is wrong and therefore we don't care. The fourth is the so-called culture wars. We live in multicultural, multi-ethnic societies. That means that a certain post-materialist rights have been recognized around gender, around ethnicity, around race, around ability. And of course, that makes some people feel that they are losing their position. Now, the right puts all those four aspects together under the strategy of populism. Now, populism is about dividing the nation into the people and the elite, us and them. But unlike left populism, which as far as I'm concerned, I think is an extremely useful strategy, right-wing populism is not just a bifurcating strategy, but a triangulation. The elites have betrayed the people because they give rights to all these others, to immigrants, to refugees, to queer, to Roma, to all these people who are now becoming the other. And this other is different today from what it was in the interwar period and the rise of fascism. It is no longer, as used to be, the Jew, the anti-Semitic link of fascism. Today, the other is kind of ambient, a good term. It is a moving other who can move from one to the other with no great problem. And the link of the international, the Black International that was mentioned, is not ideology, but aggressive behavior. So we have this sense that the other is the cause of all our ills. The great Enlightenment view of nihil sine ratione, nothing without reason, has been turned into one cause, one main or sole cause for all the ills we have, which could start from the nation and the state all the way to my personal failure. The other, whoever is being defined at each particular point, is the problem. I will stop here because it seems to me that a basic problem for what is happening today is the retreat, the failure, the abject failure of the left. And I would like to talk about it later, using, amongst other things, also my experience as being an active politician with the Radical Left Party in Greece back in 2015. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can take 20 minutes up here to discuss together before opening up. I mean, extraordinarily rich set of contributions here, and I don't quite know how to jump in, although as Kostas was speaking, and I thought it was really interesting where you were talking about a certain kind of longing, like to get inside the psyche and the wants, in a way, of these people who are attracted. It made me think of Ernst Bloch trying to advise the left, in the 30s, around how to combat fascism, understand what nostalgia, what illusions it's offering, but what is that appeal? And so I was thinking...
And let me add, found utopian fragments even in everyday speech, that way with advertisements, or, songs and so on, pop songs. Yeah, so it's very interesting that you mentioned Bloch.
And so that was making me also think about Rob's, idea of this sort of, this suffusion, this mediation of it all through, these devices and online, and how affective it is. And then thinking about that alongside, these other, how do we also think about that in terms of our modes of resistance? Because we're talking about flotillas and being on the street and, pushing back against it. So, in sort of physical ways, mobilizing ourselves against these things that are, emotional and happening behind closed doors. And so how do these, I'm being very incoherent, but how do these things come together, I suppose? Or, maybe you wish to pick up on what each other have said. I mean, we're all agreed we can't speak about this without speaking about capitalism and material need and want. But any responses to each other, or to that? Who wants to go for none?
I guess I could start.
Well done.
And someone has. But I guess picking up on what Kostas just said, because it was last, but also because it was really interesting. But the point you're making about how democracy and capitalism have always had this uneasy relationship, and now we've lost kind of mediating civil society institutions, and that made me think of I can see, and maybe it's because I spent so much time researching it, the power of digital culture and this kind of affective politics. But it's not, this is contingent. Its power is contingent. I mean, it's partly due to how these platforms have developed, but also due to just, I guess, the sheer amount of time people spend on it. And so investments tend to take shape. People's affective investments, their investments in their community, they're all mediated through these digital forms now. And there seems to be, and that might be part of the reason of your kind of 5 theses. One of them that I think is really important, partly because of I suppose what I study, but is the culture wars. And that wouldn't need to be so important if people had other kinds of investments. But the culture wars is a media war. It's one that takes place online. And you can hear it, so like Peter Thiel just did an interview with Ross Douthat, this New York Times columnist. And I recommend listening to it. It's very, I don't know, it's hard to summarize. I mean, he calls Greta Thunberg the Antichrist, effectively. But he says we've stagnated as a society, which is something I think, there's a whole left critique of economic stagnation since the 70s. But he thinks it's because the hippies won, basically, and then they instituted multiculturalism, and that prevented sort of free thought. So like the culture wars can seem like a distraction, but in this context you've outlined and that we're discussing, they're incredibly important. And the people we might wish to combat see them as kind of prime terrain of battle. So it's really important to kind of get a handle on it. But it is, as you said, so slippery.
Yeah, Coach Joe. No, I steal you all the time, so if you go first, I can steal something. You go.
Well, I just wanted to kind of extend on what Rob was saying by thinking about some of the kind of temporal imagination of some of these online communities that you mentioned, and also to kind of invite you to maybe speak a little bit more on that in terms of their understanding of, what you said about Thiel, of thinking about us stagnating as a society, is very much him having a particular chronology of history that presumes, the kind of Hegelian idea of Western spirit of history being at the very forefront of society, but looking at a global context in which now the kind of cutting edge of capitalist extraction they're seeing in non-Western societies, and there's a kind of dual relationship of both kind of disgust and repulsion towards societies where we think about, the Islamic societies of the Gulf, or, the resurgent, capitalist Chinese Communist Party. But there's also an admiration, there's also a kind of envy of the ability for them to completely decouple capital relations of production from presumptions of liberal democracy. And you can, I think, hear that a lot in the language of Thiel or Musk or even Trump, this kind of admiration of, well, there's an ability to, suppress political dissidents, suppress resistance, and ultimately envision a society in places like the United Kingdom, the United States, that might look a little bit more like Qatar, Dubai, these areas where you have this kind of enclave of very insulated elite and then a mass of kind of surplus populations. How does that idea of where the West should be in history and where it is now kind of inform the imagination of this online right that you speak about? Particularly those, the kind of anonymous examples you drew upon, of like, European Bronze Age. Like there's so much in that already about, where is the West, where's it coming from, what's the natural order of society? And I think that's driving a lot of their justification for the withdrawal from liberal democracy of saying this is how we take our rightful place back. I'm interested in that. But yeah, Liz also.
Did you want to answer?
I mean, I guess just briefly. I mean, I think you're exactly right, and there's this. That's why I mentioned the idea of theft and enjoyment, like this idea that stereotypically rendered vision of Islamic society has something the West doesn't have. They have a kind of stability, they have a coherence around the family, which is something that came up in other conversations as well, the importance of the family, and this kind of solidity that it provides. And like Trump, as kind of racist as he can be about China, is also kind of like jealous of, he's expressed jealousy of their power, and he likes MBS in Saudi Arabia. So yeah, there's this stuff, and there's this kind of struggle. I was listening to Alberto Toscano talk about his recent book on fascism, and one thing he pointed out that distinguishes what we may or may not want to call, I would not necessarily want to call it fascism today, is that fascism in its sort of classical era, I guess, had a vision of the future, it was futurist, and now they really struggle to imagine the future. So that's part of what's animating the racism is these other groups seem to have some kind of cohesion that we lost, I guess, when the hippies won, and how can we get that back? But then they're simultaneously perceived as a threat on us. So that's kind of that outrage that comes from it. Like they have something we don't have, but they also seem to be coming here. How do we grasp that sort of solidity that they have and that cohesion they have?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of throw out another provocation and maybe discuss a bit with Costas, because do you know what? I don't run home to watch parliamentary questions. I run home to watch Glastonbury. So the provocation is the left political party a mode of organising that is over, in the sense that if you are geared towards parliamentary representation, you're just getting sucked into this hollow space, and which is a militarised and securitised space, and you're getting divorced from the people. I think at the moment what is happening is we're in a cusp, and I think young people in particular are experimenting with different organisational modes. So we're not quite sure what the organisational mode that will be most effective in resistance will be, although Palestine and internationalism has shown us one answer. So yeah, that's what I want to throw out.
And you want me to answer?
Yeah, go for it. You've got the case study.
Okay, let me start by saying that whether we like it or not, the state, the sovereign state, is the political site in which politics can take place. The international, the transnational is not. You can change the government, whether by electoral politics or other politics, but that is the only place at this point in historical time where politics takes place. Now, I'm not saying that there are no different, multiple ways of organizing, you mentioned some, but to the extent that the multitude that occupies squares, that protests, that goes out and fights and even creates barricades, when the multitude becomes the people, in other words, electors, and they vote for a government, then at that point, the political party becomes important. And to that extent, it seems to me that having a left political party, which is not the Labour Party, actually, if Starmer has done anything, because you mentioned earlier the shift towards extreme right rhetoric by the organized political parties. This is what in psychology is called the overtone window. The overtone window is what is allowed to be said in public without being totally ridiculed or excluded. What the extreme center, and I totally agree with you, did was precisely to legitimize, to justify those kinds of things. When Starmer says that we have lots of foreigners in the country, and now he said that he regrets saying that. When he passes this welfare bill, cutting down the benefits for the poor in our society, clearly he justifies, sort of the wider shift to the extreme right, and we've seen it everywhere. We see it in France, we see it in Holland, in the Netherlands, we see it in bloody Denmark. So I would say sort of that the problem here is, again, let me repeat because for me it's important, the failure of the left. And I'll say a couple of words about this. We live in a transitional period. You spoke about the temporal aspect and the stagnancy. The stagnant time at the minute is the political time. Business as usual, because of the Starmers and the Macrons and the the German leaders and so on, the European Union leaders, is moving towards the extreme right. And people at this point of straight and great ontological uncertainty, they need some certainty and they need a future project. Unfortunately, the only one at this point, political discourse that has a future project is the extreme right. I'm sorry to say that, but I think we have to be realistic. And it is once we realize that we can develop, I think, a left-wing strategy. It is only the extreme right that has it, while the left has basically given up to the extreme center and has fully legitimized those kinds of attacks that are happening left, right, and center against immigrants, against queer people, and all the others of this kind. So it seems to me that we have, of course, to attack the extreme right and the extreme center, but first of all, we have to put our own house in order. We don't know what socialism for the 21st century means. We have no idea. We haven't discussed it, or it's being discussed in academic settings like here. I've done it very many times myself. But in terms of a strategy of confronting the extreme right and the extreme center at this point, we do not have it. And I think we have to own up to our failure. It is our failure. Horkheimer said that the failure of revolution leads to fascism. It seems to me that our failure means that at this point we do not have any kind of consistent strategy against the extreme right. I may be pessimistic, but it seems to me that from my point of view, we have to understand, to own up to this in order to try and create alternative and resistant strategies.
I thought it was fascinating that Kojo mentioned Zohran Mamdani, and almost like a region, like one city's politics and the potential of that echoing outwards. And I was thinking about Bethany and the new internationalist and the kind of, and you were talking about sharing stories of solidarity and struggle. So I was wondering, in relation to this then, is this, from your point of view, creating an imagination of solidarity rather than, say, an international party, and just to give sort of succor to local events? Or how do you position yourself in, if you want to say, in relation to this?
Yeah, it is hard to think of where the unit of organising is, whether it's in Parliament, in the streets, in local communities. I guess it just, when you look at how joined up the far right is becoming, and there's a difference in opinion on this, whether they are actually that coordinated, but I kind of believe they are. We need to be really international in our thinking as well, and learn from each other and make those connections. And yeah, I think the UK has had an increasing tradition of anti-raids movements, and that's kind of catching on in the US. But yeah, it's interesting your points on, sorry, just thinking about the failure of the left. I mean, I see it slightly differently in just that there has been a drift, but I wouldn't never see Keir Starmer as sort of as the left. Like true lefts have been crushed by the centre, and that has paved the way, I think, for the radical right to kind of stream through. So it's about having to resist the forces sometimes within your own party to keep your real socialist project going, and yeah, being able to do that. I'm not sure I have any answers on that either.
And I think that shocking thing is that kind of inventiveness of the right. I mean, as you say, you know, an international right in the sense it should be a contradiction in terms, but and it is also unsustainable, as you were saying, Liz. You know, what does it mean to have all these places being first? And it is just a contradiction, but it's another sort of stage, like the way in which, you know, they started to play the meme game and the humour game online, and you know, which is something that Trump has extended into state politics and, as well. You know, so there's this sense maybe in which, the left is kind of bamboozled, I suppose, by a new kind of strategies that they seem able to mobilise. Yeah, any more from here, or should we?
Could I ask Kojo a question?
Yeah, please.
Because you spoke about, you had that phrase, the psychic pleasure of violence. I just wanted to hear more about that, because I think it is a thing that missed. Like sometimes when we talk about the right, it's like, oh, they're angry, they feel left behind, but actually they're having a lot of fun sometimes. So yeah, I just wanted to hear about that, and particularly in the connection to the violence you were discussing.
No, absolutely. I think that, you know, it's the question of, well, what is the radical right offering? If we're trying to take seriously this idea that its rise has captured the political imagination in the West, and I think what we're now clearly seeing, you know, we're now, you know, almost a year into the second Trump administration, we're, you know, deep into other authoritarian governments across Europe, is that they're not offering the kind of material transformation of mid-20th century European fascism. You know, you're not seeing societies having these kind of wide-scale processes of militarization, industrialization, building up of, you know, a kind of a war state which has a certain level of material security to it that you saw, you know, in Mussolini's Italy, you know, Hitler's Germany, or Franco's Spain. But what instead you are seeing is the pleasure of often highly memeized, highly viral depictions of punishment of the, you know, what Costas kind of described as the outside of that triangulation. You know, I think drawing on the kind of the rhetorical work of someone like René Girard, who of course was Peter Thiel's doctoral supervisor. You know, I think Girard's on record saying that he thought that Thiel was going to be like this great critical theorist, and so, you know, I think we would have all suffered a lot less if he had actually followed his interest in French philosophical anthropology, rather than, you know, become a billionaire and capture the American state. But the, you know, Girard's idea of the unifying and cohering power of the sacrifice of the scapegoat, the idea that by bringing a society together, you need that expulsion of violence onto that sacrificial being, which is visible and allows for what is otherwise a relatively fractured, you know, coalition. You know, we see that with the kind of MAGA movement, that there's a lot of, you know, separation and potential fragments over religion, over, you know, the relationship of kind of this blood and soil ethno-nationalism versus capitalist, you know, expansion and production, like I said with the HB1 visa division, but it's brought together by that psychic violence upon the migrant, upon the outsiders, you know, trans populations, you know, people expressing solidarity with Palestine, students, university, all of these, you know, even aid workers are part of this sacrificial violence. And I think that that is something, that you can see the kind of, the almost kind of limbic pleasure that we see with a lot of these performances of violence, particularly online. So that's what I think of when I think about that.
May I add just one point, because I think Kodjo is absolutely right. He used the term spectacular violence. Now, as I said, I was a member of parliament when Golden Dawn was the third party in Greek parliament. There was a bunch of gangsters, however, had been voted by up to 10% of the Greek population. Eventually, all the leaders were imprisoned and the party was banned. However, what we saw at the time was how this sacrificial spirit, the spectacular violence, was key into their way of reaching into younger people. Alon Zizek speaks about the theft of enjoyment that you mentioned. However, it seems to me that everything we said comes to a conclusion that unfortunately the left do not fully understand. And this is that we do not pay sufficient attention to emotion and passion. We think that our superior logic, whether it is the Marxist theory or some other theory, whether it's Keynesian, if you're on that side, that this on its own, because it is logically superior, will carry the day. And the extreme right has shown that unless you move, you touch certain unconscious fears and desires and certain unconscious urges of the human psyche, it is very difficult to persuade people in this day and age of huge uncertainty. So this is for me a first lesson. We have to start talking and to start touching emotion and passion in people.
Sorry, could I just add one quick thing as well? I wanted to mention, I think it's, by talking about this kind of psychic violence and the pleasure of the psychic violence, I think we also can start to see the kind of gendered coordinates behind so much of the rise of the radical right. There is not a coincidental connection between the, overrepresentation of sexual violence, people with real legitimate sexual crimes to answer, not just Donald Trump, but obviously Andrew Tate being the most viral of these far-right kind of online demagogues, and the offering that's being made by the radical right in lieu of any kind of material transformation of conditions. I think you're seeing this kind of libidinal, almost sexual pleasure in the enacting of violence upon these marginalized populations, which is bringing together these coalitions of disaffected, disillusioned young men who feel that that is the only exercise of that they're able to access in the late-stage capitalist economy of the 21st century. And so I think that by understanding that psychological violence, we can understand how this is appealing to these masses of disillusioned young men through this kind of libidinal politics.
Let's go out to the floor, if that's okay, and I'll gather in little groups of questions and ask some of our panelists to come in. So, we've got the mic, so down at the front, we've got... Yeah. Anyone else want to? Yeah. So you're going to get a real workout. Then I'll put the back. So we'll go here first, then up there, and then.
Hi. Thank you very much, all of you, for great presentations. And I couldn't agree more that the left has failed, and what the position we're in is precisely because of the failure of the left, and partly, as Costa said, because we don't touch people's libidinal fantasies, really. We don't actually, the way the right has been able to do. Now, my question is mainly to Liz and all of you, really, precisely because Liz mentioned, alternative forms of organizing, and she mentioned the forms of organization we've been seeing in relation to Palestine. And I was wondering, how successful have they been? I mean, in the sense that we've all been protesting regularly for 2 years in our hundreds of thousands, in our millions, nothing changed. The flotilla that went off was intercepted. Shamefully, Greece sent drones and harassed the flotilla. The march to Gaza has been turned back by Egypt's Sisi. So, where are these alternative forms of organization that the left can harness? I mean, I'm not seeing them. And ironically, to Rob, actually, I really enjoyed your emphasis on digital culture. But ironically, it seems to me the only place where the left is, winning or having some victories is on digital platforms. I mean, we have all these sort of posts that go viral because people agree with them, but they don't translate into any political victories. So it's not just the right that is monopolizing these platforms. The left does have some victories there, but they don't translate into any political victories. So, yeah.
Thank you. And we'll go at the back there, then we'll go to Catherine, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. Excuse my voice. I'd like to thank the panel for what was really a good analysis of the problem. But I question, what is it we do immediately? In 4 years' time, there will be a general election. If we ask the majority of working class people tomorrow who they would vote for, the party that would come out on top would be Reform UK. That is a crisis in which we have less than 4 years to reverse. And I do believe the current levels of inequality in this country are incompatible with democracy. 4.5 million children living in poverty, and it's going to get worse. And I think that's one of the reasons why people have this emotional reasoning. There's a rage amongst the working class that doesn't know what the cause of it is or what the solution to it is. And I didn't hear much from a Marxist perspective about the working class, because it seems to me the most important people in this equation are the people who start a sentence saying, I'm not racist, but, and then go on to say something that is objectively racist, because they have been influenced by these narratives of division. I think that there is a brilliant handbook, Phil Paratin's book, Our Flag Stays Red, that talks about the organising in the East End in the 30s, which says you have to organise around the issues that are causing the pain that is being exploited by the fascists. So I think there's an enormous amount to do. But we have to organise with people who don't agree with us over the underlying issues if we want to win them away from and inoculate them from the far right. And can I just make a quick ad for this publication outside on the desk, Defeating Narratives of Division, well worth picking one up if you can.
Thank you. So we'll go to Catherine.
This man here.
Oh, okay, sorry, I missed you.
And then I'm off.
Okay, super. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Julian Samboma. I'm a journalist and independent researcher. You don't know me or you haven't heard of me before because I wrote a book in 2017. That was several years after the Arab Spring. And I proved actually that the Arab Spring was a CIA plot. After the Arab Spring, everybody thought it was a grassroots revolution. So I started my research and it took me 7 years. Eventually I proved it, and you would not have heard of it because the academics ignored it, because I wasn't an academic, and the journalists ignored it because they were envious. They didn't discover it. The book is called The Dialectic and the Detective, and my name is Julian Samboma. Now, to my contribution for today, I'd like to start off by saying that I agree with Costas that this crisis of the rise of the radical right is actually an economic crisis. It's the result of an economic crisis. And I did some research before. I produced a video on YouTube called The Dialectical Analysis of the Ukraine War. And actually, the Ukraine War was actually caused by the contradiction between various imperialisms, American imperialism, Russian imperialism, European imperialism. And because of the shortage of the resources, that's why they wanted to conquer Ukraine and Russia, split the resources among themselves to re-inject more life, new life into international capitalism. So I agree with you, it is a crisis of imperialism, a crisis of an economic crisis. And because they cannot solve it by plundering the resources of Russia and the Third World, because don't forget, Russia has also grabbed parts of Africa, right? So they've closed Africa off for resources. Remember, in the early days, imperialism and capitalism developed by plundering resources. Now Russia and China are blocking off those aspects. So Liz mentioned about a rules-based international order. Well, they are not going to subscribe to a rules-based international order, because if they do, then they're not going to get the resources they need to reinvigorate capitalism. So we are bound for more wars. So I think in order to counter the power of the radical right is to actually argue with people, tell them what is actually happening, that this is an economic crisis. It's not the migrants that are responsible, but it's actually the political system. And then we need to overthrow this political system. Bethany and Rob talked about the media normalizing the attacks on the poor. I theorized a couple of years ago on the effects of the media, and actually call it communicative violence. It's my theory of communicative violence, which is that the media actually function to normalize attacks on the poor, on the deprived. So basically, I developed that from the work of Engels, who said that structural violence, which he related to the poor working conditions and environmental conditions of the people, having an effect of violence because people died in the factories where he used to organize. So basically, he said that violence is not only physical, it can be psychological, it can be structural. So basing my work on Engels and critiquing the work of Slavoj Zizek and Joan Galtung, I theorized that the media is actually engaged in communicative violence.
Thank you.
I would like your opinion on that.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your astute analyses. I do have a question, because I find all of this terrifying, reform banging at the door, people like Peter Thiel becoming so theocratic. Antichrist, it's the language of theocracy. My question is, because your analyses are so terrifyingly to the point, is this crisis liquid? Can anything happen? Can we throw it? Or is it terrifyingly escalating towards a singularity? Because it sounds horribly difficult to do what we need to do. I find this overwhelming. But if it is liquid, if you think in your analyses things are up for grabs, I'd love to hear that and how it might be up for grabs. That's my question. Is it up for grabs?
Thank you. And there was one down here. Yeah.
Thank you. My question's about young people. So the Football Lads Alliance seem to have jumped on this issue of child sexual exploitation as the thing to kind of justify their rhetoric and protests. Obviously, the drama Adolescent seemed to capture Andrew Tate and the issue of rising radicalism in schools. And then you talked about the digital playground of politics, which is quite obviously a young person's area, I suppose. So, how can we support and uplift young people to protect communities and resist the far right?
Okay, let's go back to the panel. Don't feel you all need to comment on everything, but whatever speaks to you.
Okay, I shall plunge in. About the question about the likelihood that in 4 years' time we might see a reform government. My daughter keeps saying if that happens, she's leaving the country. And I keep saying, well, where exactly do you think you're going, you know? But I completely take your point that it's a failure of the left to go out and actually engage with those people who are reform voters. And I would say link it to the erosion of the trade union community base. So I think the answer is in local democracy, trade unions being active at the local level. I think we saw during the far-right orchestrated racist riots, as I always insist in calling them, a lot of young people coming out to defend mosques. to defend asylum seekers. And what our research shows at the Institute, because we've been looking at sentencing patterns, that actually a third of the sample that we've looked at of people prosecuted and sentenced are anti-racist or Muslims defending mosques. So that is the response to anti-racist resistance. I mean, I'll just give you a little example. I've got a friend who's a very elderly and lovely gentleman in Crediton who's just had a quintuple heart bypass. So he's not really up to defending the mosque at the moment, but what he does is he goes to Morrison's every day and he chats with the ladies at the till who are reform voters. And what he says to me, it's very interesting that they're actually a little bit ashamed of being reform voters, and you can actually talk to them. So we need more Peters at that local level. Thank you for the question about failure, because I just sat here thinking about poems about failure and victory, and I've always had this thing that I want on my grave: who talks of victory to endure is all. But I'm not popping off anywhere for a while, so I just want you to know that. I think, how do we measure victory? So many victories are not really victories. And I think, I mean, of course, it's terribly depressing to be marching and to see the genocide continuing and continuing and continuing. But what I would say is that because of the global movement, Israel has lost this war. They have lost all moral ground. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Let me tell you a story that Didier Ribon writes in relation to what you just said. He says, my father used to be a communist, and then over the last few years he voted for the National Front. But while as a communist he used to go out and shout about communism and be proud that he voted communist, now he does not talk to anyone about it. He's ashamed about it. And this is one characteristic of how people of the left, and in France this is very clear, we have a massive move from the Communist Party towards the extreme right, the Le Pen party. So, and that says a lot about what is happening. Again, the psychic economy, sort of the enjoyment and so on that plays out. But I wanted to answer very briefly to two questions. Is this crisis of capitalism, not economic crisis, I would say, liquid? I mean, in one sense, all crises are liquid. In other words, there may be a change. It seems to me the odds are stacked against us. That because at this point there is a clear radical project, totally false, fraudulent, a scam, but it is a radical project that is putting itself forward to people who feel scared, they fear, they have anger, they have indignation, they have all the sort of negative emotions, and nobody's trying from the left to turn those emotions into positive ones, while the extreme right is doing it. To that extent, it seems to me, and this is a first answer, we need a left with a radical project, but that does not exist. But if something like that does not emerge, not here necessarily, in any of the major countries, a radical project that really answers those things that we all agreed upon, all the problems that have created the current moment, then it seems to me it would be very difficult to do it, to reverse that trend, because the trend seems to me to be inexorable all over Europe. I mean, if the Netherlands and Denmark and Sweden have gone right wing, what will stop Britain or anyone else from following suit? So the political organization, here finished, depends very much, the type of political organization, on the struggle you're going to fight. If you're fighting, of course, against the genocide in Palestine, you need the street. So the street is important. If you're fighting, however, in order to change the direction of the government, you need either to be in the Labour Party and try to use all that kind of energy that was created around the Corbyn leadership, or to create another party, or something like that. Because at some point, as you said, in 4 years, there's going to be an election. And if there is no clear radical political project answering all these problems, it seems to me that it will be very difficult to stop Farage or whoever else is going to answer that need or that desire. And finally, you have also to create a political coalition, it seems to me, even with the extreme center. And I know very well, I've suffered even personally from the extreme center, but in order at this point to defend the minimum liberal institutions that are being undermined continuously, we need some kind of pragmatic coalition with the Labour Party people, with outsiders, liberal academics and so on, against the rise of the extreme right. It is important that we create such coalitions, even if at the same time we hold our nose because we don't like sort of our partners. So three things: the street, political coalitions, and then some intervention in the state political system through the parties.
For others who would like to?
I guess on the point on communicative violence, sorry I ran off, by the way, I was feeling very hot, and I'm losing my voice a bit. Yeah, on communicative violence, I would agree with that. I'd say, especially when we were looking at the riots last summer, I was thinking the whole time about how in the right-wing press, the obsession with hotels, even though this was the government policy to move asylum seekers to hotels, everyone thought it was a bad idea. And then it was just, they could then perpetuate the idea that we're spending all this money on putting people in five-star hotels, which is complete nonsense. And the obsession with the boats as well. So I think if there hadn't been that kind of rhetoric, we wouldn't have seen people trying to burn people alive in hotels. And I can't see how that's anything other than a kind of communicative violence. But yeah, I'll pass on if people want to answer another.
Brilliant, thank you, Daphne. And yeah, I think that point that you made about the way in which a certain type of imagery is used to perpetuate a narrative, like hotels, like, you know what I mean, the recent presumption, I don't know if people saw the Robert Jenrick video, who's very much embraced online and social media as a mechanism through which to drive the type of far-right politics in the United Kingdom, of the housing crisis in London not being the result of, Britain having this disproportionate level of landlordism compared to other countries, not tied to the massive expansion of the gap between the value of wages and the value of assets over the last 40 years, but entirely the result of net migration. I think what the far right are doing is giving images that are not coherent, but speak towards a narrative that can resonate with people on an emotional basis, and I think that the hotel ones is very much an example of that. To a couple of the questions that were suggested, I think I also want to speak to the question of, is this a liquid crisis or is everything crystallized, and are we essentially, going to hell in the handbasket without any kind of reversal? And, again, not to place too much optimism in electoral politics, but I do think, talking about this from London, which has its own kind of radical municipal history, thinking about the GLC, thinking about its particular relationship to the United Kingdom as a whole, I do think that there's some optimism to be taken from what happened in New York, given their similar positions in terms of being at the very forefront of finance capital, being at the very acute end of global inequality, having cities that are very much the receptacle of global capital flows of wealth. The fact that, over a period of seemingly weeks, you had the transformation of a mayoral campaign that was polling at 0 not so long ago into defeating the most well-financed campaign in New York political history with the Andrew Cuomo campaign, 25 million raised in the super PAC in order to dismiss, Zara Mamdani as a socialist and a terrorist, or, and everything else they threw at him, but winning, not even closely, but pretty handsomely in the end, because it spoke to people's material conditions, young people's material conditions, talked about a rent freeze, talked about universal childcare, talked about a 2% increase on wealth over £1 million. I think that these are material concerns that are able to bring people into a new type of left politics, which I think gives us opportunity and gives us hope. I think there's there's a lot more restrictions in the United Kingdom, constitutionally, electorally. We don't have a primary system. We don't even have a codified constitution. So, the ability to try and move the Westminster, quasi-feudal architecture into a place that can allow for these type of insurgent left projects, I think is very difficult. But I do think that there's hope in terms of how a kind of menu of left politics can resonate with mass populations, even at this stage of late stage capitalism. So I do think that's something that we should try and hold on to. I don't think that it's fully sealed, signed and sealed at the moment.
Kojo, you're offering to stand for mayor of London then? I support you in that quest.
Absolutely not. No, I will be.
Someone tweet it now, quick.
Rob, do you want to wrap up with some final thoughts?
I have to end it. Okay, well, I'll just speak to some of the questions about digital media, social media, because that's what I think about. This question about why is the left on social media not translating the way the right is, and there's lots of reasons for that. I think one of them is left in general terms, and there's exceptions, but left discourse on social media tends to be about things like credential checking, suggesting you missed something, proving your argument wrong, kind of owning one another, sort of. And on the right, they do that too, but they also, like if you listen to someone like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate, they're offering a vision of how you can become a hero, right? How you can achieve agency. And that comes with a critique. Reactionaries have a critique of the present, and they have the enormous advantage of not needing to be coherent or offer a kind of like logical program, like the left. That's a great weakness of the left, I think, especially particularly in social media discourse. But in terms of this question of like young people and their interest in Andrew Tate and figures like that, Jordan Peterson is very popular with young people. There is a way you could read that as a source of optimism. Jordan Peterson sells out stadiums around the world for 3-hour lectures. People come to him in droves for these. Andrew Tate, execrable character, but he has a critique, right? He has a very critical disposition. He talks about the Matrix, the red pill, and so on. I certainly don't endorse that, but there is something there that young people are interested in someone who is offering a critique, and that's what young people always. That's part of becoming a young person is questioning the world around you. So there's an enormous energy and appetite for it. But the left is largely absent from those discussions. So there is a potential to make it maybe more liquid, for new voices to come in. Mamdani's not really a social media phenomenon. He's very much kind of old-fashioned in a way. But he uses it, but he's not really like, people have described him as a social media campaigner, but in a way, that I don't think that totally accurately characterized. He's definitely active on social media. I'm not saying he's not. But as you said, he's offering something. It's as basic as that sometimes. And I think often the left is not.
Okay, we're a little bit over time. We really want you to talk and enjoy the reception outside, and I'm sure some of these people will continue to talk to you. But thank you so much for
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther.
Thank you.
That was like a difficult job for you.